Good morning and welcome to Chapter 7 in this series of videos on the expeditions of James Cook. And as you can see today, I've chosen for my virtual background the animal which really set the imagination of Europe alight and still is absolutely delightful for non-Australians who come across them, and even Australians, I've been told. Now, this is actually a later painting, but it was based on Sydney Parkinson's first drawing of a kangaroo, which we'll be talking about in a moment. We left Cook and the Endeavour and his crew leaving New Zealand, having fulfilled the mission, that is to say, to check that New Zealand was not part of the southern continent, the vast southern continent, which was supposed to be enormous and full of riches. And Cook has also drawn a very accurate map of the two islands, and occasionally mentioning which places might be good to settle. So the whole general framework of his expeditions to prepare any useful information for the British Empire has been followed. So now Cook plans to travel home, and he plans to travel home via South America. That way, if I'm correctly, yes, that's right. That way, I have a map over there, and is expecting to follow the east coast of New Holland. New Holland being the name of the town for Australia, because I remember mentioning that the Dutch were the first Europeans to visit Australia, they have the Dutch had fairly good maps of the west and the north. Absolutely vast place, and so he's going to follow the east coast of New Holland. Now, of course, if you were to go in a sailing ship today up the east coast of Australia, you think, I must be careful of the Great Barrier Reef. But naturally, of course, Cook didn't know about this, and very nearly became a cropper. So he sets off on the east coast, and one of the first places that he settles, he visits, is Botany Bay. And there's Botany Bay today, just to give you an idea of the sort of thing that he would see. It probably doesn't look that different in a couple of hundred years, because I've chosen a part which has not got a city on it. And so he calls it Botany Bay because of the tremendous excitement of the scientists on the voyage for the number of unknown, that is to say, the number of plants unknown to Europeans, which were found there. And this is a good moment to perhaps remind you that when the first voyage gets back to England, the whole world of botany and natural history is extremely excited, and it's a very significant rise in the number of species known to European science. Very significant. I can't remember if it's 10% or 20% more species than they'd ever known before, but it's something like that. So now Botany Bay, of course, is going to become extremely important in the future, because some years later, after the death of James Cook, Joseph Banks, who by this time will be the the chair of the Royal Society, and will be asked his opinion, or will give his opinion about a good place to put a penal colony. That at this time, the huge number of prisoners in 18th century Britain, and naturally, you're not surprised to hear that the conditions of living for the prisoners were not a great priority of any government, and so they used to pile them up in prison hulks, that is to say, ships anchored off the Thames, which were not very comfortable places to live. And now France had recently set up a penal colony, a prison colony in New Caledonia, and so the British were thinking, oh, well, this is looking like a good idea. And it's Banks who gives who suggests that Botany Bay in New Holland, because Australia is a name which comes much later, would be a good place. And so the aim is both to reduce the prison population of Britain, secondly, to materialize the sovereignty, that is to materialize the, remember that Cook is going to claim possession in the name of the king, and so obviously from the point of view of the British Empire, it's much better to have people there, even if it's a penal colony, and they probably already realize that prisoners, when they are freed at the end of their sentence, may be tempted to stay in a place like this, rather than take the risky trip back to Britain and probably not very good living conditions in Britain. And that's indeed what happened. And the first fleet has become a mythical foundation myth of Australia. The first fleet left Portsmouth in May 1787, and it consisted of 2 Royal Navy vessels, 3 store ships, and 6 convict ships carrying between 1,000 and 1,500 convicts, as well as Marines, seamen, civil officers, and free people, arriving in January 1788, so 250 days later. And they arrived in Botany Bay, but a few days later moved to the place which is today occupied by Sydney. So this was supposed to be, yes, as I said, a penal colony, an imperial outpost, all the more important now that the United States had been lost. North America had been lost to the British Empire. And thirdly, a chance to get in and materialize before the French did. Indeed, I'm not quite sure about the exact position of the French colonization at this time, but La Pérouse, who was wandering around the world in 1788, arrived off Botany Bay in January 1788 and bumped into the first fleet by coincidence, or perhaps somebody had told them that it might be there, and that way the French, the French were obviously sort of looking around and might easily, perhaps, have set up a penal colony before the British if things had turned out different. And even today in Australia, the 26th of January is officially named Australia Day. Although I've already mentioned it's become much more contested in the last 20 years, and today there are probably more people involved in protests at Invasion Day, the other name for the Safe Day, than there are in celebrating Australia Day. There's been an attempt to move the day, the national day, from the 26th of January to some other date, given that the first fleet is something that certainly Indigenous Australians and their allies do not really wish to celebrate. So there is Botany Bay, and if I click in the right place, you'll see Cook's map, then published in 1773, of Botany Bay in New South Wales. And just another reminder that it may be that Cook saw himself above everything else as a map maker, and he was a very good map maker. Now, a little further over at Sydney today, this is what Sydney looks like today. As you can see, it is a little more populated, and there is the flagship monument, if you like, of Australia, the one that's the only monument which everybody, or most people know of, and this is Sydney Opera House, a rather avant-garde piece in Sydney. I was lucky enough to go, and I can assure you that it actually looks better than that. I was rather unsure that I liked it before I went, but seeing it was quite good. They very quickly met with some Australian Aboriginals, and this is a point where Cook mentions in his journals something which is often quoted since: all they seemed to want was for us to be gone. So much for the idea of taking possession with the consent of the natives, and quoting from the instructions. Cook continues to write very much as a sailor, and so the next pages, 129, for example, have considerable numbers of technical instructions. The best way to sail into Botany Bay without beaching your ship, which is a good reminder how dangerous the whole thing was. He mentions the water birds. There were plenty of species of water birds which the crew were unfamiliar with, and a large crop, if you like, of oysters, mussels, and cockles. And so you can imagine, seeing that the crew had been at sea for some time, that they were very pleased to have some of this fresh seafood. Now, Cook describes the local people, saying that they didn't wear clothes, that they were naked, but they were sometimes painted. And so off they head north, beyond where Brisbane is today, and I think I already mentioned, partly for revision and partly for entertainment, the BBC's series. I think it was the BBC. No, maybe it wasn't. Television series, The Ship, where a modern crew follow in Cook's footsteps in a reality TV style, and they follow the whole route there, and this includes some of the debates with Indigenous Australians, First Nations. Interestingly enough, on page 132, a footnote tells us that one of the sailors deserted and never came back. So this reminds us of the status of the crew. This is a military ship. They're not allowed to change their mind and say, well, yeah, I'd like to settle here. And indeed, later on, we will see some deserters brought back and punished. But here is a deserter who succeeded. Now, I'm not sure. It's not absolutely clear to me if every deserter who succeeded would be marked in the journal. I would suspect that it might be quite difficult to hide desertions from the Admiralty, because, of course, Cook is very much writing for his boss. But in any case, one deserted and never came back, and may have lived happily ever after, or not. This is unknown waters, and so guiding the ship is very difficult indeed, although this is a modern three-mast ship, and so it has more flexibility. It's easier for it to sail against the wind. Apparently, the more masts you have, the easier it is to sail against the wind. I can't say that I've ever done this, but that's what I'm told. And so, what do they do when they're moving forward? Well, they have the two boats, because they have two boats on the ship, which are in front of them, making soundings and saying, "Oh yes, the water is 3 I don't know how many 10 fathoms deep here. It's fine. You can go forward." Oh no, the water is only 4 fathoms deep here. It's best not to come this way. So this is an extremely painstaking and long way of advancing, but it's more or less the only choice. They did eventually find a lake, but that was somewhat difficult. And before they did that, they came across this place, Thirsty Sound, which he called Thirsty Sound, thirsty, because they found no fresh water there. As he moves northward through page 138, I'm referring, I think I'll mention it, to Edward's edition of Cook's Journal. They were hoping to come across the islands that Quiros had discovered considerable time before. They then came into terrible trouble, and in fact they hit the barrier reef, which is a coral reef, but coral is very solid and not good for ships. And there was a big hole in the bottom of the ship. This was almost the end. Yes, the ship could easily have sunk there and disappeared forever. In which case, its history would have been very different, because if I remember correctly, Cook has not yet sent back to England any journals. So all of his records of taking possession of this and that would have been lost. Once he gets up to the north of Australia into Indonesia, I know he sends some journal home on a ship with a ship that he meets there. This sort of safety mechanism, just in case we don't come back. At least the information can get there. Yes, and of course all his maps of New Zealand, etc., would have been lost forever. And they were very, very close to just all sinking and drowning. They had to throw lots of things off the ship. They threw off 40 or 50 tons in order to make the boat lighter. This included throwing away the cannons. Now they probably recovered some of these. Spoiler: they don't all drown. They probably recovered some of these, but it's an interesting case, or perhaps not. One of the cannons, which was thrown off the ship, was recovered hundreds of years later and is now in some museum somewhere. So everybody was thinking that they would have to abandon ships, and you can imagine people were pretty frightened. They finally managed to limp to shore by using a method, and he will speak a bit about it in his journals on page 141, and that is that they take one of the sails, and they manage to pass one of the sails, the big sails, under the ship, so that the hull is partially plugged by sail. Again, extremely difficult to do. Don't ask me for help. If you're in this situation, I would be no good at all. But this is sufficient, and they do manage to limp to safety. And the ship's artist does makes a drawing of the ship when it's managed to get to the mainland, and there they're going to repair it, repair the big hole and get all the water out, and fortunately for them, manage to get somewhere. And there they also will meet then some of the Aboriginals. Oh, first of all, there we have the map of the Endeavour River, because even though he's just almost drowned, he doesn't stop making maps, and so he calls this the Endeavour River, and you can see there what it looks like, and these little numbers. This is all I am assuming that this is the depth of the sea at that point, and so this is enough information for another British ship to safely arrive here. So the whole map making exercise is partly information for the Admiralty, but also very much information for the captains of following ships, if they're coming to trade or to invade or to colonize, etc. Then they will be in less danger. And indeed, and here we have Parkinson's drawing of Australian Aboriginals there. Yeah, so you can see a very, very dark-skinned, it represents them as very dark-skinned races. And there you have the spear and shield, and it's not quite a sword, but it's something along those lines. And I'm wondering what this spear is made with. I'm imagining that it's made with bone, with animal bone. If you don't have access to metal making workshops, then bone is pretty good. But metal is better, as most people will find out. Now, this is a moment I can mention some information about the Australian Aboriginals. It's been estimated that there were 750,000 Australian Aboriginals in 1788 when European colonisation started. These are difficult numbers. We don't know how exact they are because it's a difficult thing to count. And there were 8 times less 120 years later, down to about 93,000 by 1900. So many thousands died as British settlers drove people off their lands and brought diseases such as measles, smallpox and tuberculosis, which the Aboriginals had no resistance to, in particular because the Aboriginal peoples had not been in contact with Asian peoples for many thousands of years, and so the natural development of viruses and so on was not going to go in their favour. The history of Aboriginals is also the history of colonial governments trying to eliminate Aboriginal culture. Indigenous Australians were segregated from the rest of society and still are in some parts of Australia today in a sort of reservation system, and forced to, and others were forced to adopt British customs and abandon their own culture. One of the most shocking episodes is the episode of the stolen generation in the 20th century, when it was literally the case that if an Aboriginal family allowed their children to play outside, the police might take them and never bring them back. So this, the idea was, the racist idea was, it's better for Aboriginal children to be brought up with white parents, so we'll take them there. Now, the number of Aboriginals, however, began to recover in the 20th century, and by around today, there seem to be about 700,000 Indigenous people in Australia, making up about 3% of the country's total inhabitants. So if we get back to Cook, delighted to find wild yams and coconuts and lots of fish on page 148. Huge amounts of fish, and one of the interesting points about the fish here is that it mentions how they are shared out, and there was a custom of the sea at the time. I'd like to know more about this. According to which, when they came into a nice new chunk of food, they would share it out equally among the whole of the ship's crew. That is to say, the captain or the officers would not get more than the simple sailors or the marines. So there's something very democratic about this, whereas in general, shipside life was anything but democratic. So there's something interesting there. Groups of crew were sent off hunting, and they found these huge turtles, more than 200 pounds each turtle, and I am told they are delicious. I'm perfectly prepared to believe it. It has been suggested that taking so many turtles was a cause of serious conflict with the locals, who expected them to be shared out with them as well. These are things which are difficult to understand, because, of course, between the lack of linguistic knowledge on the two sides and the general superior attitude of the British, very difficult to get a clear view. But it's been apparently some of the locals were shot in this conflict, and there was an attempt to burn down the British camp. It's obviously extremely tense there. And just as in New Zealand, just to remind you, of course, we often think about the first contact, but of course, after the first contact, the locals did not send out the information by Facebook so that all the Indigenous peoples around Australia knew about it. No, of course, there were many, many first contacts. Every contact was a first contact. And this continued for many decades. That is to say, as the British colonisers gradually moved across the continent with explorers like Flinders and so on, then they would often come on land for the first time in contact with Aboriginal peoples who'd never seen Europeans before. So the Europeans would arrive on a horse or something, which also must have been quite impressive. They do see some locals at this point, Cook, page 151, who appear to be unwilling to approach, but do finally come and then for the first time get to meet Tupaya. And unfortunately for almost everybody, in fact, what happened in New Zealand does not happen again. That is to say, in New Zealand, they discovered that because the Maori had just come a few hundred years earlier from Polynesian islands, the languages, they could understand each other. But Australian peoples had not been in contact with Polynesia for many thousands of years, and the perhaps tens of thousands of years, and the languages were completely different. There was a very large number of languages in Australia at the time. I mean, hundreds. And so the result was that Tobias didn't understand a word they said, and so they tried to carry out some negotiations anyway. And in this next episode, page 157, one of the men saw an animal, something less than a greyhound. It was of a mouse colour, very slender, made and swift of foot. There you go. So that is the kangaroo, and as you can see, Parkinson hasn't noticed the pouch which is, well, perhaps it's a male, actually. I think only the females have a pouch, but I'm not sure. But, he wouldn't be looking for one either, because we don't have marsupials in Europe. And the jumping of the kangaroo was very, very impressive to them. And so this is really the moment, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. And caught people's imagination. At this point, they're still worrying about the barrier reef. They're repairing the ship, which takes a good long time to repair a ship. Even if you have pretty good carpenters, you've got to go and find the right kind of wood. You might have some in stock, but it can be quite complex. And as was Cook's habit, he went up on a hill on a nearby island and saw the massive coral reef going off into the distance for many, many, many miles. That was a little bit discouraging. He was worried for another reason, that although they managed to find the turtles and the fish, this is page 163 now, he was worried because they had only 3 months provisions on board. And they were advancing rather slowly. And I will come back to that in chapter 8. So this was the end of chapter 7, and there are a number of other chapters to come. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm now going to click on the appropriate buttons to make it all end. Say goodbye to the kangaroo.